What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another weekly 3D model. This week we're going to be making a seaplane, and we're going to be doing things a little bit different for this week's video. Usually when you model vehicles, or really any object you're trying to recreate, you use image planes to help block out all the shapes, especially if it's modeled after a specific model or brand. And this can not only help you be more accurate with all the proportions and all the shapes, but it can also save you a lot of time on the 3D modeling process. And we've done this in many videos, like the abandoned VW van or the crashed Black Hawk helicopter. In the past, you may have heard me talk about creating models without using image planes, and that's what we're going to be doing in this week's video. Now, if you're making a model for a studio or for a client, then yes, you should always use image planes for the reasons I just mentioned. But if you're creating an asset for fun or just for practice, I highly recommend trying to not use an image plane. I know this might sound a little crazy, but hear me out. By not using an image plane, it forces you to think about the shapes a little bit more. You need to work a little bit harder to try to figure out the proportions and not rely so much on tracing an image to figure out your shapes, which you don't always have available to you in the real world. I found it also made me get a lot quicker at making 3D models. Now, this is just my personal opinion, and I know it may not work for everyone, or some others may not agree with this whole idea, but this has helped me a lot in my 3D career, and I recommend you try it as well. I can't tell you the amount of times in my work life when a client wants a specific model or a specific piece of equipment recreated, but they have no blueprints or schematics to show the shape and size. You can't Google the object because it's their unique design, or it's private to their company, or you just can't find any orthographic images on Google, and you're basically relying on some photos they've provided to recreate the asset. This happens all the time, and this is where this practice really comes in handy. Of course, it will be more challenging, but the more you do it, the better you will get, and this has helped me tremendously in my work life as a 3D artist. Now, I am going to use a few reference images that I gathered from Google, and I always use some sort of reference when I work. Whether it be images related to the subject that I found on Google Images, or other similar objects I can reference to for ideas, it could be really anything, but I always try to use some sort of reference, like the seaplanes images I found on Google, for example. But since I don't have a blueprint to trace, we're going to have to figure out the proportions and how all these shapes fit together by playing around with them and slowly piecing them together. Now, I'm not going to lie, this one took a lot longer than I planned it to, and this was mainly because I decided to create this asset in the evening. Now, I know this sounds like an excuse, but honestly, I rarely model at night. I usually do my 3D modeling in the mornings or the afternoons when my brain is fully awake and I can easily keep track of my time. And now I remember why I don't model in the evenings, because I completely got tunnel vision and lost track of time. So I'll speed through this video a bit so I don't bore you, but if you're interested in seeing this full video in real time, it will be available on my Patreon page, along with all the working files. So if you're interested in seeing any of that, it will all be linked in the description below. So my goal was to do all of the 3D modeling in one sitting. I have family visiting, so it really needs to get done fairly quickly, which doesn't leave me a lot of time. Now, there are a few things I could have done differently that would have saved me a bunch of time, which we will go over later on in the video, but a big one were those doors. Since they are never really opened, I really didn't have to model them as separate objects. Originally, I was just going to create the door seams and the materials with a bump map and only cut out the windows. And this would save me a bunch of time and also a lot of extra polys. But for some reason, I felt like making my life more difficult and creating them as separate objects. This is just one thing I wanted to mention at the beginning, because in reality, I could have saved a ton of time by just simply drawing in the indented line in the shape of a front and rear door in Substance Painter, and you probably wouldn't have been able to notice much of a difference. But why not? I guess it's just good practice. Now, of course, the blocking out stage is always very important, but even more so when you're not using an image plane. I want to get those shapes looking half decent, and I honestly don't even know much about planes to begin with, so we'll have to try to take our time and figure it out. I'm also not going to completely focus on topology right away. We can always clean things up later on, which I honestly probably should have spent a little bit more time cleaning things up and not being so lazy. But I need to focus on blocking out all those main shapes first, and try to figure out how they all fit together properly. Now, I do need to stress the fact that by not focusing on topology while modeling, you can quickly dig yourself a hole of messy topology that needs to be cleaned up in the end. And this can sometimes make things more difficult than they really have to be. So approach with caution. If you're fairly new to 3D modeling or Maya, it's important to keep things clean and focus on quads while blocking things out. Don't dig yourself that unnecessary hole. If you're more experienced, you can dig all the holes you want, if of course you know how to get out of them. And to be honest, I kind of fell into that hole in this video. I rushed a little bit too much to get the modeling done when I realized what time it was, which resulted in some artifacts and weird shading issues on some of my objects, which I then had to spend even more time cleaning them up later on at the end of the video. And I could have avoided all of that by making sure the low poly shapes were in a good state before adding more polys to them. Sometimes it can be tempting just to add more polys and add more detail, but you need to make sure that those low poly shapes are in a good state before you do that. It can be a slippery slope, so take your time, don't rush things, especially when blocking things out. Now throughout this video, you'll see me mostly working on one side of the plane. Besides the front exhaust, both sides are basically identical, so to make my life easier, I'm going to focus on just one side, and then we can duplicate it over to create the other side later on. Now, because I had to rush this one a little bit, I simplified a lot of the shapes, so we'll talk about that more later on in the video when we go over the UVs, but if I were to redo it, I would have spent a little bit more time on those small details, and I think we could have had a much more realistic result in the end. Like I said, we will talk about this more later on in the video, but for now we need to focus on blocking everything out and figure out how these shapes fit together. Oh, and one last thing, if you enjoy these types of videos and you want to see more random 3D models, please consider subscribing to the channel, it would really help me out. Also, please check out my Patreon page, it's by far my biggest support platform, so if you want to access other types of content or you just want to help support my art, please go check that out. Alright, enough of me talking, let's go make a plane. Alright, so here is the C-plane in its finished form. Now, as you can see, I went ahead and just duplicated some of the objects over from the right side or left side to the opposite side of the plane. So this wing, for example, and all these little components and the light, I just took this whole wing and just duplicated it over. Same with this bottom little floaty leg as well. Now, there are a few small details I decided to add last minute. For example, these tiny little bolts down this pipe. I just added these because I thought they would just be a little bit more obvious rather than just adding it as a bump into the material. I thought you could see the bump a little bit more by adding those objects. Obviously, this is not necessary. You don't have to do that, but I just thought it would just add a little bit more detail. Along with these tiny little screws on the top of this pole, I just wanted to add a bit more detail at the end. Like I said, there's lots of extra detail you could have added into this, which we'll talk about soon enough, but those are just a tiny few details, actually, along with this one as well. They're just these plastic pieces, cylinders that are just crossing each other just to help support these pieces as well. So just another little tiny detail I decided to add in. But everything else is basically the exact same. So what I decided to do for the textures was break this thing up into two different groups for the two different textures I have applied. So on the very first group is basically the body. It's the main objects of the plane. I decided to remove the windows just because I had extra room on my other texture map. But as you can see, it's basically the whole plane object. Now there's a few things I could have done differently with this one. One main one I could have done was just basically, before duplicating this left side of the shell over, I could have just UV'd it and then flipped it over so they were sharing the same UV space. But the main reason why I didn't do that, I just wanted to add some letters and some text on the side of the plane, and they would just be reversed if I did that. So I had to split it into two and actually use two separate UVs. But that's just one little detail if you're not adding text. If you wanted to save a little bit of extra time when you're UVing, I could have just UV'd the half and then split it over and attached it. And that way they would be sharing the same UV space. But everything else is pretty straightforward. I tried to fill in as much space in my UV editor just to take advantage of all that real estate, and I can get the most out of those textures. And the second group is everything else on the plane. So basically the legs, the poles, and the little antennas, the engine, and all the other little components. Now I did, of course, copy this side over, so these two are sharing the same UV space, as well as these little objects on the side. They're all sharing the same UV space. So basically everything from the right side is flipped over, as well as all these little engine components. Since there's so many of them, they're all stacked on top of each other. I knew you wouldn't be seeing any repeating patterns since it's kind of buried in there, and the shadows would help hide it, so I didn't worry about splitting these up. It would obviously take a lot of unnecessary space as well, so just wanted to stack them all together here. And the big reason why these windows, as you can see, are pink, just because they're also sharing the same UV space. Since they're shaped differently, I can just duplicate it and rotate them. So I had to mirror them over. So that's why you're seeing the different colors, but these are also sharing all the same UV space. The only ones I didn't were the front windows, just because I thought you would see repeating patterns. If we had some weird like grime or dirt on the window, you would see it repeating on the other one. So I just decided to separate those as well. But everything else is pretty straightforward. I tried to make sure that my shells were either horizontal or vertical, not only to save space in my UV map. If they were vertically placed, it would just take up a lot of unnecessary space. But it also helps with your materials. When you're applying those materials in Substance, I don't want anything to be looking slanted. If I have like dirt and stuff, I want it to be running along the pieces just to make it look more realistic. So that's just a small detail I decided to do as well. This one's shifted over for some reason, so let's fix that. But everything is pretty straightforward. I decided just to keep it into 2 textures so it's realistic if you wanted to use it as a game asset. But obviously the less textures you have, the better for game engines. So I didn't want to do anything ridiculous. Now, of course, it is a little bit high in polys. I went ahead and smoothed some of these. So for example, this body, I did add 1 subdivision to it just to smooth it out. But that's not completely necessary, especially if you're having 2 meshes, which you would probably do if you're actually creating it for a video game asset. So what I decided to do was just keep some objects on the side to go through that with you. And I can show you exactly what I would do differently. So the main thing, which I mentioned at the very beginning of this video that I would do differently, is not add these doors as separate objects. Since they're never opened, I mean, it would have been cool to open one, but it just wouldn't be realistic to have an open door on a plane. And we could have just avoided a lot of unnecessary polys as well as time by just adding these doors as a bump, just drawing a line, an indented line into the material, and you probably wouldn't have been able to really notice much of a difference. So what I did here was just quickly duplicate one over to show you. I honestly would have just kept this wall or this whole side of the plane like this. Maybe I could have cut out just the windows. That way it would just look a little bit different, especially this back one. I added a little bit of bump to the window, if you can tell. So I could have just basically removed a simple window, taken one of these squares, for example, and just removed it. And I could have positioned that more closely to this window, and then left the doors just as a simple plane that I could have just drawn into the materials with a bump map. And that would have saved me a lot of time. And like I said, you probably wouldn't have been able to notice that detail. And that would probably be smart to do this for a video game asset. You don't need all those extra polys. Of course, I had to add them because I had a lot of cutouts, but like I said, not really necessary. And here's an example of the whole plane in a lower poly form. So as you can see, they look fairly similar. These bottom pieces are a lot lower polyed, so obviously you can see those edges a bit more. And if I smooth it out, you see the curvature. So you could go through and add 1 extra poly, let's say around here, 1 edge loop. And that way you can just help that curvature a little bit, just so it's not as blocked out. But even that looks good, and that would be fine to use in my opinion. You don't really need to smooth it out and add all those polys to it. And same with the shell, I didn't actually add a subdivision. So if I compare these 2 together, you can see that one is much higher in polys and this one's a lot lower. So you don't have to add all those details. You can get away with a lot of it, especially if you're using a high and low poly model where you can bake that curvature into the materials. So when I use, let's say, this object in game, it would look very similar, almost identical, because it would be taking that information from the materials and using them on this lower poly mesh. That's really how video game assets work, and that's something you could have done. I definitely didn't have time this weekend for that, but I wanted to show you just basically before smoothing out all these objects, you can leave it in a low poly state for your lower poly model. And here is the low poly actually just over top. So if I wanted to actually use it as a low and high poly model, they would have to be overlapped, stacked right on top of each other so that information could be transferred over. So for example, this main hull, you could just basically do it just like this, where they're stacked on top of each other, and I would use the low poly model, where is it? Right here, as the in-game mesh, and this high one to create my textures on. So just something to keep in mind if you're interested. I have other videos on my channel that covers this topic more in depth, but I just wanted to quickly go over it because I know a few of you will probably be asking about that. Now, besides, of course, doing the door seams, there's other things I could have done to save on polys. And obviously these little bolts up the side, I could have just not added those. This is a lot of unnecessary polys that goes up this pole. And same with the door hinges. They're not too detailed, but these little bolts that I added to them, I could have removed those and not smoothed. I actually didn't even smooth these out, but you could have simplified those shapes a lot more, as well as this motor. Some of these details, like these spheres, for example, you could just start off with a lot lower poly sphere to begin with, just to save on all those polys in the engine. So Little details, these bolts, didn't have to add them. You can add that directly into the material. This screw on the front, for example, I added a boolean into it. Not necessary. You could just honestly keep that as one face and it would look like it's just booleaned into it with the sticking out just the tiniest bit, like that. So there's these tiny little things you can do. This actually is another great one. I could have kept it as one object and just drawn a black line as a bump into the material so it looks like they're two separate pieces rather than actually separating them. So there's lots of things that you could do. Now, that being said, if I had more time, I would have added a lot more detail into the tiny objects, especially if I was looking to get something a lot more realistic. A big one would be all of these little objects that attach these legs. I just simplified it. I didn't even look online too much to see how these components work. As you can see, I just added a simple cylinder and some sort of rectangle, just so it looks like some component that attaches itself. This is definitely not functional. It probably looks nothing like the real ones do in real life, but it's just something that I thought would just fit since you're not going to really pay attention to those details. But I feel like if I had more time and I invested more time into these specific components, it would make it look a lot more realistic, like real components that are actually attached together, or these door hinges, which I already mentioned. They're just simplified. I'm sure you can add a lot more detail to them by making them higher in polys. And these wings are another really big one. I don't really know how planes work to begin with, so don't attack me in the comments if these wings don't really make sense, but I just simplified it. I added just a simple rectangle for this one and then these pieces that can turn like planes do. Obviously there's no real components, like these things are just kind of hovering in there that act like they can bend them, but you could spend more time to make this more realistic. I don't know how these components actually work, but I could have spent more time looking into it on Google and then implementing those specific details into the model. And those little details can go an extremely long way in making it more realistic and making it more interesting to look at. Especially this rear plane wing, this is kind of just hovering in there, but I could have added something, I'm sure, to make it look a little bit more realistic. So those are some few details, little details that I would have added or spent more time. And I feel like we could have had just a little bit better results. Another thing as well, if you're just looking to get something that's photorealistic, I would have added all those bolts into the object. If you're not going for a low poly, more efficient model, I could have just started duplicating these bolts all over the place. And I did that into the materials and Substance, but because of the resolution, you're kind of limited by that detail. And of course, if you can add those little half spheres everywhere, I'm sure the model would look really cool. So that's one thing that I probably would have done for a higher poly mesh if I had more time to put into it. Of course, there's tons of bolts on this thing, so it just didn't make sense, especially in my time frame, to spend time doing that. So I just decided to add it into the material. But that's a cool little detail that I feel like would have gone a long way. But that's basically everything. That is how I prepared this C-plane for textures. So I applied a material to each group here. That way, when we jump over to Substance in the texture set list, you'll see those two materials applied and we can start texturing this plane. So let's do that. Let's export the C-plane and let's jump over to Substance Painter. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and load in that FBX file from Maya. Now, one thing I just want to note, the first thing I always do when I jump into Substance is change the aspect ratio of the camera. For some reason, it starts super low and at 17, which gives you this weird kind of perspective that's unrealistic to how the human eye would look at objects. So I always bump that right up to 50 almost every time I jump in. That way it just looks more realistic to how you would see it in real life. So after we're done setting that, I'm going to go bake out those textures. And once those are all baked out, we are ready to apply some materials. Now, all of the materials are fairly straightforward. I use every material that comes with Substance Painter. There's only one exception. There's one specific model called Ship Hull Paint Chipped. Now, this is in my library. I'm not sure if I added this like months ago or years ago to my library, but it's a really cool material that I decided to add as some extra bump, some sort of paneling effect onto my material. If you look at planes, they have lots of bolts everywhere and they have lots of paneling effects from all the metal. And I thought by adding this ship hull, it would just add a little bit extra bump into that metal. That way it just doesn't look so flat. Now, like I already mentioned, we're going to add all those bolts also into the materials. And I do this with just that paint along path tool. So I just use a simple brush, the basic hard brush, that comes with Substance Painter, and then using that paint along path, I can go ahead and start painting on those bolts. Now there's a lot of bolts that are on these planes, so I spent a little bit of time, which I'll speed up in this video. But if you're interested in seeing this in real time, like you want to see every step of the texturing process, that will be available on my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. Also, the Substance Painter file will be in there, so if you want to see how any of these materials or layers are stacked, and you can actually dive right into the project itself and see how I prepared all those materials. Oh, and also I just wanted to make a quick note. I forgot for some reason to hit the symmetry tool, the little button on the very top, just so you can basically paint on one side and you can paint on the other at the exact same time. So when I was applying all these bolts, I forgot to actually press the symmetry, which I thought I did. So I had to just turn the plane over and re-add all those bolts in the same position, which just drags out the whole process. And we're not looking to waste unnecessary time here. So just wanted to make a note of that. Don't make the same mistake I did. I ended up catching that halfway through and I decided to turn that on, which really made everything a lot easier, so I can just paint on one side and replicate the same thing on the other. So don't follow exactly what I do here. If you just click on that little symmetry tool on the top, you can save yourself a lot of time. Now, also when it came to texturing, I didn't really know how I wanted this plane to look. I'm not too familiar with airplanes, so I was kind of going into this pretty blindly, and I didn't know how I wanted to design it to make it look just interesting to look at. So I found this really cool reference of a plane on Google Images. I'm not sure who created this model. If any of you know, let me know and I can add it into the description. They did a fantastic job, and I decided to use this paint style and incorporate it into my airplane. But it's a fairly straightforward airplane. It's basically white and just a little bit of yellow just to add some color to it. But I decided to keep it fairly straightforward. Now, one thing that was bugging me throughout this whole process were those bottom floaties, those feet that this airplane basically lands on the water with. I didn't know if I wanted to make it similar to my reference I was using that had some sort of different material like a metal, but the more I looked online at seaplanes, the more it just looked like they were painted the same color as the plane. And that's what I decided to do at the last minute, just kind of change that metal look to more of a white that was similar to the body color on my airplane. But everything else is straightforward. We're gonna texture this airplane like we do every other model on this channel. We're gonna start filling in those empty meshes with some sort of material, and then we can come back to it and start refining those details afterwards. I find if you spend too long focused on getting the perfect material, it can just really waste a lot of time, because once you start adding in the materials on the other objects around it, they start to look a little bit different and they need to be reworked. And you can kind of run into this loop of running in circles of making an object look perfect, and then when you add in the material beside it, suddenly it looks a little bit different. So I try not to stress too much about getting everything perfect right away. Let's just fill in all these empty white meshes with some sort of material, and then we can always refine them as we go. And that is actually why these pre-built materials and smart materials that come with Substance are so amazing. They are just a really great foundation. So for example, if you know some certain object wants to be metal, you can pick one of the metal smart materials and then build off of that. I find a lot of beginners, for some reason, don't want to use the built-in materials. They feel like it's cheating. They feel like they're not good material artists if they're using those, but they're there for a reason. They're there to make your life a lot easier. So don't be afraid to use them. If anything, I recommend you use them, and you can build off of it. You can add different fill layers in those materials to add more grunge. You can refine stuff. You can even turn off specific layers in those smart materials if you don't want them. They're there to help you out. So don't be afraid to use them. If anything, use them to your advantage. They're going to help your whole texturing process be a lot quicker. And rather than just building everything from scratch, which is just a lot really unnecessary. You don't really need to do that. Of course, it's going to look good on your portfolio if you specifically show the process of building a material from scratch, and it's good to know that. But to be honest, you should use all of these to your advantage. Oh, also one more quick thing. When I was doing all of the line work on that painting, so the yellow that goes around the front and the black, I was doing this with my mouse, which made it quite challenging to try to draw certain lines. And I don't have a stylus with me, so that's one thing I also wanted to make a quick note. If you're using a stylus or something, it can make your whole texturing process a bit easier when you have to draw in those custom paint jobs. So I will have to play around with this a little bit because I am using a mouse, but just one other thing I wanted to note. If you do have a stylus available, it might make the whole custom painting a little bit easier for yourself. So let's slowly start applying some materials to these objects, and we can start texturing our seaplane. All right, and that is everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create the seaplane. This one was a lot of fun to make, and I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video. And if you did, please hit that like button, and also please consider subscribing to the channel. Don't forget, this full video will be available in real time along with all the working files, and you can find it all available on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. And as always, I want to give a massive thank you to all of my Patreons. All of your support goes an extremely long way in helping support my page, so I just want to say thank you for your continuous support. Alright, thanks for tuning in to this week's video, and don't forget, consistency is key, so keep up the practice, and I will catch you guys in the next one.